The barn door had not been latched properly, and that small carelessness changed Charles Ramsey's life forever. It was the autumn of 1873 in the territory of Kansas, where the grass rolled out in gold and amber waves beneath skies so wide they could swallow a man's pride whole, and where the wind off the plains carried the smell of coming frost before the first hard freeze ever arrived. Charles had been running his homestead outside the town of Caldwell for 3 years by then, ever since he came west from Missouri with little more than a mule, a good rifle, a set of honest hands, and the kind of stubbornness that either builds a life or breaks a man. He had managed to build something not grand, not rich, but solid and real. A 2-room house with a stone chimney, a well that had not gone dry even in summer, 40 acres under cultivation, and a small herd of cattle he was slowly expanding. A barn that housed 3 horses, 2 milk cows, a loft full of good hay, and on the night of the 15th of October, as it turned out, one sleeping woman who was not supposed to be there. Charles had gone out after supper because he could hear one of the horses moving restlessly, the sound of hooves against the stall boards carrying across the cold night air to where he sat on his porch smoking his pipe. He was 28 years old, broad-shouldered, weathered in the way that men go weathered when they live under the open sky, with dark hair that needed cutting and hands that bore the permanent stain of soil and honest work. He was not a hard man, though life had given him plenty of reason to harden. He pulled his coat on over his flannel shirt, took the lantern from the hook beside the door, and walked across the yard to the barn. The door swung open easier than it should have. He stepped inside and lifted the lantern, and the yellow light spread out across the familiar interior, the horses in their stalls, the smell of hay and animals and old wood, and then he saw her. She was lying in the far corner of the barn, beyond the last stall, curled on her side in a pile of loose hay. She had pulled her knees toward her chest and her coat, a thin, worn thing that was nowhere near enough for a Kansas October night, was drawn tight around her. Her hair was a dark reddish-brown, and strands of it had come loose from whatever pins had held it and fallen across her face. She was deeply asleep. Her breathing was slow and even, the kind of breathing that comes from a person who has been exhausted to their very bones. Charles stood very still for a long moment. He had heard stories about drifters and outlaws and all manner of trouble that could wander onto a man's property. Every rancher and homesteader in the territory had those stories. But he looked at this woman in the hay, and what he saw was not trouble. He saw cold and hunger, and the kind of bone-deep tiredness that came from walking too far in too little time with too little help. He looked at the thin coat. He looked at the boots on her feet, which had worn through at one sole. He looked at the small bundle tied in cloth that she had tucked under her head like a pillow, holding it even in sleep. He did not wake her. He did not demand to know who she was or what she was doing in his barn or where she had come from. He turned around, walked back to his house, went to the cedar chest at the foot of his bed, and took out 2 wool blankets, good heavy ones that his mother had made before she passed, the kind that could hold warmth through a hard night. He carried them back to the barn, moved quietly so as not to startle her, and laid them gently over her sleeping form, tucking the edges in so the warmth would not escape. Then he went back to his house, set the lantern on the table, and sat down in his chair by the stove. He thought about that for a while. About what it meant that a woman was sleeping in his barn, about what had driven her here, about whether she would still be there in the morning or whether she would be gone before first light, slipping away like she had never been. He found that he hoped she would still be there. He was surprised by that. He had not thought about hoping for anything connected to another person in a long time. He put more wood in the stove, went to bed, and did not sleep well. When the sky went pale gray before sunrise and Charles came out again, he moved to the barn door with the kind of deliberate casualness of a man who was pretending to himself that he was not anxious. He pushed it open and looked in. She was sitting up. She had both blankets wrapped around her shoulders, and she was staring at him with eyes that were the color of Autumn Creek water, brown with flecks of amber and green, and they were full of wariness and calculation, and something underneath all that which looked very much like fear, held carefully in check by a woman who had learned not to let fear show. She was younger than he had first guessed. 23 or 24, he thought. She was not soft. There was a quality to her face that spoke of difficulty endured rather than avoided, but she was striking in the way that people are striking when they carry themselves with complete and deliberate composure even under circumstances that would have undone someone else. "Good morning," Charles said. He kept his voice level and easy, the way he would talk to a spooked horse. "Good morning," she said. Her voice was low and careful, and she did not let go of the blankets. "There is coffee on the stove," he said, "and I have eggs and salt pork if you have not eaten." She watched him. He could see her trying to determine what kind of man he was, what the cost would be, what the angle was. He recognized that kind of watching. He had seen it before in people who had been treated badly by those who claimed to be offering something. "Why?" she asked. It was a single word, but it carried everything. Why the blankets? Why the offer? Why no demands? Why no anger? Charles looked at her steadily. "Because it is cold," he said, "and you need food. Those are reasons enough where I come from." Something shifted behind her eyes. Not trust, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of a decision to consider it. "I am not going to stay," she said. "I just needed somewhere to sleep." "All right," he said, "but you can have breakfast first regardless." She came out of the barn still wrapped in his mother's blankets, and she followed him across the yard and into the kitchen, and she sat down at his table with the particular careful posture of someone who was ready to stand up and run at a moment's notice. He put the coffee in front of her without ceremony, cracked eggs into the iron skillet, sliced salt pork, and did all of it without pressing her with conversation or with looks that lingered. When the food was on the table, he sat down across from her and ate his own meal and gave her the space to eat without talking if she wanted to. She ate like someone who had not eaten in at least a day, maybe more. She was controlled about it. She did not fall on the food, but the speed and the thoroughness told him what he needed to know. "My name is Ellen Talbot," she said eventually, when the worst of the hunger had been addressed. "Charles Ramsey," he said. "This is my place." "I know," she said. "I asked in town whose barn that was before she paused. I would not have gone into it without knowing it was a decent man's." He noticed that she had made inquiries. She had thought about it before she came. That told him she was not reckless, only desperate, and desperate for a reason. "Are you in trouble?" he asked. He asked it the same way he had done everything else, straightforward, without drama, the way you ask a plain and necessary question. She looked at him. "What kind of trouble are you asking about?" "The kind that might come to my door looking for you," he said. "No," she said, and it had the ring of truth. "No one is coming after me. I left Wichita 2 weeks ago. I walked most of the way. I had a little money, but it ran out, and She stopped again. "I am going to Colorado. I have an aunt in Pueblo who said I could come." 2 weeks from Wichita on foot, Charles said. He did the arithmetic in his head. Wichita was roughly 50 miles northeast of Caldwell. "You moved slowly." "I was not well for a few days," she said simply. He nodded. He did not push. "You can rest here today if you need to," he said, "and tomorrow. There is no reason to rush off into cold weather when you are not yet recovered." She looked at him with that careful measuring gaze again. "What do you get out of that arrangement?" "Nothing," he said. "I have the space and the food and the time." He paused. "Mrs. Holloway in town would tell you I am a decent sort if you want a reference. Or the Reverend Marsh. I am not trying to extract anything from you, Miss Talbot. You look like you need a few days of rest and proper food, and this is a big empty house with a spare room that goes unused." He said it matter-of-factly enough that it did not sound like a plea, which he thought was probably important. She looked at the coffee cup in her hands for a long moment. "One day," she said. "One day is fine," he said. But the day turned to 2, and 2 turned to 4. Because on the second day it rained, a hard, cold, driving autumn rain that came in from the northwest and did not let up. And on the third day, Ellen woke up with a fever that had her shaking under those same wool blankets in the spare room while Charles made broth from the bone stock he kept on the back of the stove and brought it to her with a cold cloth for her head. She was furious at her own body for the betrayal. He could see it in the tight set of her jaw and the way her eyes burned with frustration even as her temperature burned with something else. "I am not trying to be a burden," she told him, her voice rough and uneven. "You are not," he said, and he meant it completely. "You do not even know me," she said. "I know you walked 50 miles by yourself in October," he said. "I know you researched whose barn was decent before you asked for shelter. I know you said one day and you meant it." He set the bowl down on the small table beside the bed. "That is more than I know about some people I have known for years." She looked at him for a moment, and some of the fierceness in her eyes softened into something more uncertain. "Why are you like this?" she asked. He thought about that seriously, the way she had asked it. "My mother raised me to believe that a person's worth is not conditional on what they can offer you back," he said. "She was a very good woman. She died 4 years ago, and I think about what she would make of my choices with some regularity." "She sounds like someone worth thinking about," Ellen said softly. "She was," he said. He left her to sleep and went about his work. There was always work on a homestead, always something that needed doing, cattle to check on and fences to walk and wood to split against the coming winter. And he found himself listening for sounds from the house with a kind of attention he had not paid to anything in years. She was better on the 4th day, up and insisting on helping, and when he came in at noon, she had made cornbread from the supplies in his kitchen, and had cleaned the dishes that had been sitting in the basin, and had reorganized his shelf of preserved goods with an efficiency that made him laugh out loud when he saw it. "You did not have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. She was standing by the window with the afternoon light on her face, and she had color back in her cheeks and her hair was pinned up neatly, and he made himself look away before the thought finished itself in a way that seemed inappropriate. "It looks better," he said about the shelves. "I confess I had not thought much about the organization." "Men generally do not," she said, but it was not unkind. There was a small smile at the corner of her mouth. He sat down at the table. She poured coffee without being asked and brought it over and sat across from him, and the whole thing had a domestic ease to it that was startling given that they had known each other for less than a week. "Tell me about Colorado," he said. She wrapped her hands around her cup. "My Aunt Margaret married a rancher named Fowler 6 years ago. They have land outside Pueblo. She has written to me twice in the past year saying there was room for me, that I was welcome." She paused. I did not want to go to her. I wanted to manage for myself, but Wichita, she stopped. "You do not have to tell me," he said. "I know," she said again. She seemed to make a decision. "I was working in Wichita as a seamstress. I had a room at Mrs. Dale's boarding house. I was doing well enough. And then the man who owned the building where I worked, his name was Gerald Crane, decided that the terms of employment ought to include things that were not in any contract I signed." She said it evenly, without drama, but her jaw was tight. "When I refused him, he told Mrs. Dale things about me that were not true, and Mrs. Dale told me to leave. And Crane told the other business owners along the street that I was." She shook her head. "None of it was true, but the kind of lie he told is the kind that sticks to a woman whether it is true or not. So I had nothing in Wichita anymore and nowhere to go but west." Charles was quiet for a moment. He was thinking about Gerald Crane and what he would like to say to Gerald Crane, but what he said instead was, "I am sorry that happened to you. It was wrong and it was unjust, and the fact that a man can do that to a woman with no consequence is one of the more shameful things about the way things are arranged." She looked at him with an expression that was almost surprised. "Most men would say it is a hard world and a woman ought to have been more careful." "Most men would be wrong," he said. She looked at her coffee. Something in her shoulders released, a very small amount, barely visible, but he noticed it. "How long until you feel well enough to travel?" he asked. "Another few days," she said. "I will leave you in peace as soon as I am able." He nodded. "There is no rush," he said. "But if you wanted to send a letter to your aunt, letting her know you are on your way, there is a post out of Caldwell that goes twice a week. I could take it in tomorrow." "That is a good idea," she said, and she looked almost grateful in a way that went beyond the practical suggestion. He had paper and pen in the house. He kept up correspondence with his younger sister in Missouri, and he left them on the table after supper and went out to check the horses. And when he came back in, she was at the table writing by lamplight, bent over the page with complete concentration, and the sight of her there did something to the interior of his chest that he chose not to examine too closely. She was there the next day, and the day after that. She insisted on earning her keep, and he let her, because she was not the kind of woman who wanted charity, and he understood the importance of that. She cooked and she mended, and she helped him with a section of fence on the south side of his pasture, working alongside him without complaint in the October cold. And they talked as they worked, not about anything of tremendous consequence at first, but gradually the conversation deepened, the way conversations do between two people who are discovering that the other one is more interesting than they expected. He learned that she had grown up in Missouri too, in a town called Lexington, not so far from where his family had lived, and that she had come west 4 years ago with her father, who had died of fever in Wichita the following year, leaving her alone and 20 years old with a set of skills and a determined will and no family closer than an aunt in Colorado. She was 24 now, which was what he had guessed. She had educated herself beyond the usual because her father had been a reader and had believed women had minds worth developing. She had opinions about politics and literature and the organization of the Western territories, and she expressed them without apology, which Charles found refreshing in a way he had not anticipated. He was 30 years old. He had turned it in July and spent the day alone, which was how he spent most of his days, and he had not seriously thought about courting anyone in years. There had been a woman in Caldwell he had been briefly interested in, but she had married a cattle merchant from Texas, and Charles had concluded without too much bitterness that he was perhaps not the kind of man who inspired urgency in women, being too quiet and too settled for the adventurous sort, and not wealthy or exciting enough for the practical ones. He was revising this assessment in the company of Ellen Talbot without fully acknowledging that he was doing so. On the 8th day after she had first arrived, the weather turned clear and cold and bright, and Ellen announced at breakfast that she felt fully recovered and ought to start thinking about the road again. Charles looked at his eggs. "Colorado is a long way from here by foot," he said. "I know, and it is getting toward winter. I know that too." He looked up. "I could drive you to the stage line. In Wichita there is a stage that goes south through Indian Territory and on to Pueblo with a few stops along the way. It would be faster and safer than walking, and the fare is not unreasonable." She looked uncomfortable. "I cannot let you pay my fare." "I am not offering to pay it," he said. "I am offering to drive you to Wichita so you do not have to walk 50 miles in November weather." He paused. "You can pay your own fare. I just do not want you walking to Wichita in this cold." She was quiet for a moment. He could see her weighing it. "That is a 4-day round trip for you," she said. "I know. I have done longer for less." "Why?" she asked again. She had a way of getting back to that word. He looked at her across the table, and this time he did not look away quickly, and he did not give her the practical answer. He gave her the true one. "Because you came into my barn and I gave you blankets, and now I feel responsible for you getting where you are going safely," he said. "And because I would like the time." She looked at him for a long, level moment. Her brown-amber eyes were clear and direct. "The time," she said quietly. "Yes," he said. "I do not meet many people I find genuinely interesting to talk to. I am aware that is a peculiar thing to say." "It is not peculiar," she said after a pause. "It is honest." She agreed to let him drive her. They left 2 days later, in the early morning with the sky still dark blue and the stars fading. Charles's good bay horse hitched to the wagon alongside his younger roan, with blankets piled on the wagon seat and a basket of food and Charles's rifle under the bench, because traveling across the Kansas plains unarmed in 1873 was not a thing a sensible person did. The Indian Wars were ongoing. The Comanche and Kiowa raids in the Southern Territories had been a source of significant violence and loss, And while Caldwell sat at the edge of Indian Territory, with the complexities and injustices of forced reservation policies playing out along its borders, the road to Wichita was traveled enough to be reasonably safe for a man who knew what he was doing. Charles knew what he was doing. They drove north through the morning, and the prairie stretched around them enormous and gold and bronze under the October sky, and Ellen sat beside him on the wagon bench wrapped in her newly mended coat. He had found a piece of good wool in the back of his wardrobe, left by a previous owner of the homestead, and she had made herself a proper lining, and she looked out at the landscape with an expression he could not entirely read. "Do you love it?" he asked. "The prairie?" She considered. "I think I could," she said. "If it were mine, if I were not just passing through it." She paused. "When I was walking before Caldwell, there were mornings when the sun came up and the light was—" She shook her head. "I have never seen light like that anywhere else, like the sky was something you could touch." "I know exactly the light you mean," he said. "It is why I stayed. There were other places, more settled, more convenient." He shook his head. "But that light," she smiled. It was the first full smile he had seen from her, not the small controlled one, but an open one, without calculation, and it rearranged something in his understanding of what constituted beauty. They stopped at midday to rest the horses and eat, sitting on the wagon bed with the food between them, the wind pulling at Ellen's hair so that she had to hold it with one hand. She told him about her father, who had been a schoolteacher and a botanist of some amateur dedication, who had taught her the names of every wildflower on the Missouri plains, and who had died at 51 of a fever that should not have killed a healthy man but did. "I was angry for a long time," she said. "Not at anyone in particular, just at the fact of it, that a good man could be taken so easily and so fast." "Yes," Charles said simply. She looked at him. "You know that feeling." "My mother," he said. "Fever also, the winter of '69. "I am sorry," she said, and it was the simple, direct kind of condolence that actually meant something. "She would have liked you," he said before he could think better of it. He felt himself go slightly self-conscious. "I apologize, that is—" "Do not apologize," Ellen said quietly. "That is one of the finest things anyone has said to me." They looked at each other for a moment, sitting on the tailgate of the wagon in the middle of the Kansas prairie, and the wind moved through the grass around them, and the horses shifted and blew, and Charles thought that he was in a considerable amount of difficulty that had arrived so quietly and so completely that he had not noticed it building until now. They made good time and camped the first night near a creek with cottonwood trees along its bank, and Charles built a fire, and she made coffee over it, and they sat with their bedrolls on opposite sides of the fire in the proper way, and talked until the fire burned low. She asked him about his plans for the homestead, and he found himself telling her things he had not told anyone about wanting to expand the cattle operation, about the land he had his eye on to the east, about the kind of life he was building slowly and with intention. "You are not the kind of man who does anything by half," she said. "Is that a criticism?" he asked. "No," she said. "It is an admiration." He looked across the fire at her. She was watching the coals, and the firelight was warm on her face. She was not looking at him, but he thought she was aware of him with the same particular attention that he was aware of her. "Ellen," he said. She looked up. He had not planned what came next, and he had the sudden awareness that he ought to plan it rather than say something he would regret. "I am glad the door was unlatched," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "So am I," she said, and then she looked back at the fire, and they did not speak again for a while, but the silence was warm. The second day of travel brought them through the outskirts of a small settlement where a family they knew, acquaintances of Charles's from a cattle sale the previous spring. A couple named McIntyre with 3 children were stopping at the general store. The McIntyres invited them in for a meal, and the way Mrs. McIntyre looked at Ellen and then at Charles told Charles that he was not doing a particularly good job of hiding whatever was written on his face. "Your young woman is very fine," Mrs. McIntyre said quietly to him while Ellen was admiring the children's drawings tacked to the wall. "She is not," Charles began. "She is a friend. She is traveling to Colorado," said Mrs. McIntyre, with a tone that encompassed everything that could not be said politely about the word. That night, their second camp, the temperature dropped considerably, and Ellen's bedroll on the other side of the fire was clearly insufficient, and after 20 minutes of watching her pull her blankets tighter and not say anything about it, Charles took one of his own heavy blankets and set it next to her. "I have two," he said. "Take it." She looked at the blanket and then at him. "You are always giving me blankets," she said, and there was something in her voice that was low and warm and complicated. "It is a habit I appear to have developed specifically for you," he said. She laughed, a real laugh, quiet and surprised, and pulled the blanket around her. "Thank you, Charles," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name without the formal distance of Mr. Ramsey, and it moved through him like the first note of a song. On the third day they reached Wichita. The town had grown considerably since Charles had last been through it, and it showed all the marks of a cattle town in the latter stages of the trail drive era: wide muddy streets, a multiplicity of saloons and hotels, the smell of livestock and commerce, and the particular desperation that gathers in places where men come to spend what they have worked for. Ellen was quiet as they drove through, and he understood why. This place had been unkind to her. It was written in the careful way she held herself. He found the stage line office on the main street and helped her with the arrangements while she paid for her ticket with the careful reserve she had been keeping. And when it was settled, they had 2 days before the next southbound stage left, which meant she needed somewhere to stay. "Mrs. Holloway's cousin has a boarding house here," Charles said. "She is a decent woman. I can take you there." Ellen nodded. She was looking out at the street. "I used to walk down this street every day," she said. "It is strange how a place can go from being home to being somewhere you do not recognize yourself." "You are going somewhere better," he said. She turned to look at him. "I suppose," she said, and she did not sound entirely certain. He took her to the boarding house and paid for his own room, and they had dinner together at a small establishment across the street, and afterward they walked along the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to the open flat land beyond, and the sky above was vast and full of early stars. They walked without touching, properly and correctly, but close enough that he was aware of every small distance between them. "I have been thinking," Ellen said, "about what you said by the fire, about being glad the door was unlatched." "Yes," he said. He kept his voice even. "I have been thinking about it a great deal," she said. She was looking straight ahead at the darkening horizon. "And I do not know what to do with it." "You do not have to do anything with it," he said. "I said it because it was true. I do not have an expectation attached to it. But you might have a hope," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, "I might have a hope." She stopped walking and turned to face him. The last light of the sky was behind her, and her face was in the blue shadow, and her eyes were clear and direct. "I am going to Colorado," she said. "I know," he said. "And you are going back to Caldwell." "Yes." She looked at him. He stood very still and let her look. "Charles," she said, and the way she said his name this time had something in it that made it hard to breathe properly. "I do not have anything to offer you. I am a woman with a worn-out coat and a bundle of clothing and $2 left after the stage ticket and no permanent address. I am not what a man builds a homestead toward." "That is the most incorrect thing you have said in the entire time I have known you," he said, and his voice was steady but intense in a way that surprised him. She blinked. "What a man builds a homestead toward," he said, "is a life, and life means people. Specific people who make the work and the cold and the difficulty worth doing." He took a breath. "I am not proposing anything. I am not asking anything of you. I am simply telling you that what you think your value is does not match what I observe it to be, and I wanted you to know that before you left." She looked at him for a long moment. Her chin was level and her eyes were bright, and something in her face had shifted into something that was raw and real and unguarded in a way he had not seen from her before. "I will write to you," she said, "from Pueblo, if you want that." "I want that very much," he said. She reached out and put her hand on his arm, just for a moment, and then she withdrew it and they stood there in the fading light, and it was somehow both almost nothing and entirely everything. He left the morning she was to board the stage, early enough to start the 2-day drive back to Caldwell. He told himself it was practical. He had cattle to see too, and the weather was changing. And he tried very hard not to make the goodbye into anything that would make it more difficult for her. He shook her hand at the boarding house door in the morning with her bundle at her feet and her repaired coat fastened to the throat, and he told her to travel safely and to write, and she said she would, and then she said, "Charles." He turned back. "You are the best man I have met in a long time," she said quietly. "I want you to know that." He held that for a moment. "That is a high compliment from you," he said. "I intend to deserve it." And he drove back to Caldwell with the prairie expanding around him in every direction, and the sky enormous above, and the 2 wool blankets on the wagon seat beside him where she had been sitting. The first letter came 3 weeks later, forwarded from Caldwell where he had left his name at the post office. It was 2 pages long, written in a careful, clear hand, and she described Pueblo and her Aunt Margaret and the Fowler Ranch with the particular precise observational skill he had come to expect from her. Her aunt was warm and practical, and the husband was decent, and there was work for her helping with the household and also with a dressmaking business her aunt had established in the small town. She was well. She was eating properly. The mountains were visible from the kitchen window, and she had not yet grown accustomed to them. At the end of the letter, after all the practical news, she had written, "I think about that first morning at your table more often than makes sense. The coffee was very good, but I do not think that is the reason." He read that sentence 4 times. Then he sat down and wrote back. He wrote her about the cattle and the fence and the hard frost that had come at the end of October and the neighbor, old Gus Fredericks, who had helped him lay in a cord of wood against the coming winter. He wrote about the mare who had foaled early, and the foal who was doing well. He wrote about the prairie light she had described, and how he had noticed it specifically for her sake on the morning he drove back from Wichita, and how the knowing she had seen it too made it different somehow. He wrote, "I find the house quieter than I expected to find it, given that you were only in it for 8 days. I do not believe the quietness is about the house." She wrote back within 2 weeks. The letters continued through November and December and into the new year, crossing the distance between Kansas and Colorado on the twice-weekly post, building between them a correspondence that was the most intimate thing either of them had engaged in since the loss of their respective parents. They wrote honestly. They wrote about difficulty and about hope, and about what they thought the West was becoming, and whether there was justice in it. Ellen wrote about the situation of the Ute people in the Colorado territories, whose lands were being systematically reduced and whose autonomy was being dismantled by a government that had made promises it had no intention of keeping. And she wrote about it with an anger that was both clear-eyed and compassionate. And Charles wrote back at length and with his own perspective, which agreed with hers in substance, and added the observations of a man who had lived on the Kansas border with Indian Territory and had watched the systematic injustices play out with complicated feelings and insufficient power to change them. They were not just exchanging pleasantries. They were building something in those letters, and they both knew it, though neither of them had yet put a name to it in the letters directly. In January of 1874, Ellen's Aunt Margaret fell ill with a respiratory ailment that confined her to bed for several weeks, and Ellen wrote that she was managing the household almost entirely on her own, and that Fowler was a good man who was clearly terrified of losing his wife, and that she had found the experience clarifying in terms of what she wanted her own life to look like. She wrote, "I find I am not afraid of the work. I find I am only afraid of doing it perpetually alone." Charles read that and set the letter down on his kitchen table and looked out at the prairie and made a decision. He wrote back the next day, "I have been thinking about something for the past 2 months, and I have tried to be sensible and practical about it, and I find that I cannot be, which is unusual for me. I am going to ask something of you that I have no right to ask given the circumstances, and if you tell me it is too much, I will understand entirely, and this correspondence can continue as it has. But I would very much like to come to Pueblo in the spring. Not to bring you back to Kansas, though I will tell you that I have been working on the house since November with a specific intention in mind, but simply to see you in person and to ask you something that I cannot ask correctly by letter. Ellen received this letter in the 3rd week of January. She read it in the kitchen of the Fowler house while her aunt slept in the next room and the snow fell on the mountains outside the window. She wrote back, "Come in April. The mountains are finest in April." He arrived on the 14th of April, 1874, having driven his wagon as far as Pueblo with 2 of his horses, and a change of good clothes, and a small box that he had been carrying in his inside coat pocket since he crossed into Colorado, and which was making him considerably more nervous than anything he had experienced in 3 years of solo homesteading. Pueblo was a different kind of town than Caldwell, more permanent feeling, with the mountains at its back giving it a solidity and a gravitas that the plains towns did not have. He found the Fowler place by the directions Ellen had sent, a neat ranch house on the edge of a good working spread, and when he drove up the track, he saw her come out of the house before he had even pulled the horses to a stop. She was standing on the porch in a dark blue dress with her hair up, and the April sunlight on the mountains behind her was exactly what she had promised, and she was looking at him with an expression that could only be described as relief, the particular relief of someone who has been waiting for something and was not entirely certain it would arrive. He climbed down from the wagon. She came down the porch steps. They stood in front of each other for the first time since the morning in Wichita, and there was a moment where neither of them spoke, but it was not an awkward silence. It was the silence of 2 people who had been talking to each other for months and who were now, for the first time, able to hear the other one properly. "You look well," he said. "So do you," she said. She was looking at him with those clear amber-brown eyes. "You got a haircut." "I did," he said. He touched the back of his neck involuntarily, and she laughed. Her Aunt Margaret, recovered and up and considerably interested in this development, invited him in for a meal and assessed him over the dinner table with the frank directness of a woman who had earned the right to be direct. She asked him about his land and his operation and his intentions, and he answered all of it honestly and without puffery. And at the end of the meal, Margaret Fowler looked at her niece across the table and did not say anything, but what did not get said a great deal. That evening, Charles and Ellen walked out to the edge of the property where a rise gave them a view of the mountains in the last light, and they stood side by side in the way that had become familiar from their 2 days of camping, close enough to feel the warmth of each other. "I renovated the spare room," he said. She turned to look at him. "And I have been enlarging the kitchen," he said, "because I noticed when you were there that the kitchen was too small for a person who knows how to use one properly." "Charles," she said softly, "and I bought Mrs. Holloway's second milking cow from her in February because I thought the operation could sustain 2. "You are not asking me through the cow," she said, and there was a laugh in her voice but something trembling behind it. "No," he said. He turned to face her and took the small box from his coat pocket. He opened it. Inside was a ring, not an elaborate one, a plain silver band with a small garnet set in it, the garnet the color of the prairie in autumn. "I am asking you properly," he said. "Ellen Talbot, I would like very much for you to consider coming back to Caldwell with me. Not because I need help with the homestead, though I do. Not because the house needs a person in it, though it does. Because I have thought about you every day since October and I do not want to stop, and I would like the opportunity to spend the rest of my life finding out all the things about you that there was not time to find out in the letter writing." She looked at the ring and then at his face. Her expression was open in a way he had not seen even in the best moments of their journey together. "You are sure?" she said. Not a question exactly, more like a thing she needed to say out loud. "I have never been more sure of anything," he said, "and I recognize that is a large claim for a man who is generally cautious." "It is," she agreed. She was still looking at his face. He waited. He would wait as long as was necessary. Yes, she said. It came out steadier than he had expected, and when it did he realized that she had been building to this for a long time, the same way he had, the same slow and deliberate construction. Yes, Charles, I would like that very much. He put the ring on her finger and she looked at it in the mountain light, and then she looked at him, and he took her hand in both of his, and they stood on that rise above the Fowler ranch with the mountains enormous and violet in the distance, and the spring coming up around them in the smell of warming earth and new grass. And he thought that he had never in his life been so grateful for a barn door that had been left unlatched. They were married in June, 6 weeks later, in the small church in Caldwell. It was not a large wedding. Mrs. Holloway was there with her husband, Gus Fredericks, and his wife, the Reverend Marsh, who officiated. Ellen's Aunt Margaret and James Fowler, who had made the journey from Pueblo specifically for the occasion, which meant a great deal to both of them. Charles's younger sister Clara had written that she could not make the journey from Missouri on short notice, but that she was full of joy and would come and visit in the fall, and her letter had made Ellen cry, which she did not admit, but which was visible in the way she folded the letter and put it carefully in the small box she kept for important papers. Ellen wore a dress she had made herself from good cream-colored wool, with a collar of lace she had traded needlework for in Caldwell, and when she came down the aisle toward him, Charles was aware of standing in a church in Kansas in June with the windows open and the summer smell coming in, and of being, simply and profoundly, exactly where he was supposed to be. She stood beside him at the altar and looked at him sideways and said, very quietly, so only he could hear, "You are still giving me blankets." "I intend to give you blankets for the rest of your life," he said, and the Reverend Marsh looked at them with some puzzlement but proceeded. The ceremony was brief, and the celebration afterward was generous and warm, with food that Mrs. Holloway and Margaret Fowler had conspired to produce in the church hall, and fiddle music from a man named Dawes who played by ear and did it very well. Charles danced with his wife. His wife, and the feeling of her hand in his in the lamplight, was something that had no word in any language he knew. In the first year of their marriage the homestead changed. Not extravagantly, they were practical people, but steadily. Ellen established a kitchen garden that produced abundantly, and she kept books for the cattle operation with a precision Charles had not managed on his own. She started a correspondence with a woman in Caldwell who was attempting to establish a school, and she contributed to the effort with both labor and money when the herd had a good year. She made the house into a home in ways that were not decorative but essential, the quality of warmth and attention and intelligence that settled into a place where a person genuinely inhabits it rather than just occupying it. Charles watched all of this with a continuous low hum of amazement and gratitude that never quite resolved into something he could express completely. He expressed it in the way he had always expressed things, in actions, in presence, in the quiet, consistent attention of a man who was fully aware of how much he had. In February of 1875, Ellen told him over breakfast that she was expecting their first child. He was quiet for a moment, the coffee cup in his hand. "Charles," she said, watching him with that careful attention she had never quite stopped applying to his face even after all the months of knowing him. "I am very happy," he said, and then he had to put the coffee cup down because his hands were not steady, and she came around the table and he put his arms around her and held on. "Are you crying?" she said, into his shoulder. "Absolutely not," he said. His voice was not entirely steady. "Charles Ramsey," she said. "I am extremely happy," he said again. She laughed and held him back. The baby was born in October of 1875, a boy they named Thomas after Ellen's father. He arrived on a clear, cold night with the help of Mrs. Holloway, who served as midwife, and he was healthy and loud about his opinions from the first minute, which Charles privately thought was exactly right. He sat beside Ellen afterward, while she held the baby in the lamplight, both of them exhausted and overwhelmed, and filled up to the edges with something for which the word happy was entirely insufficient. Thomas Daniel Ramsey, Ellen said softly, looking at the baby's face. He has your eyes, Charles said. He has your chin, she said. Poor child. My chin is a good chin, Charles said, and she laughed. Clara came from Missouri in the spring of 1876, as she had promised. She was 23, younger than Charles by 7 years, brown-haired and quick and very like their mother in her warmth and her directness. She arrived in Caldwell on the stage with 2 trunks and enormous enthusiasm, and when she met Ellen she took one look at her and said, "Charles told me you were remarkable, and for once in his life he did not understate." Ellen looked at Charles. "You said that?" "In a letter," he said, slightly self-conscious. "He wrote me pages about you before he even went to Pueblo," Clara said cheerfully. "Absolute pages. I have never seen him write so many words about anything in my life." "Pages," Ellen said. "Clara," Charles said. "I will get the other trunk," Clara said, still cheerful, and moved away. Ellen turned to look at her husband. He had the expression of a man who had been found out and was trying to determine the appropriate amount of self-consciousness to display. "Pages," she said again. "You are a compelling subject," he said. She took his hand and squeezed it, and he looked down at their joined hands and then at her face, and she was smiling in the way she had smiled across the fire on the second night of their journey, open and warm and entirely real. Clara stayed for 3 weeks, which turned into a month, which turned into the conversation where she told them she had no particular reason to go back to Missouri, and asked if they needed help on the homestead. They did, in fact, and they were glad to have her. And by summer she was established in the spare room and was proving herself to be enormously useful and extremely good with young Thomas, who had developed a specific fondness for his aunt that involved presenting her with whatever he had most recently picked up off the ground as a gift. The year 1876 was also the year Charles made the land purchase he had been planning since before he had asked Ellen to marry him. He had been watching a 400-acre parcel to the east of his existing land since his 2nd year in Kansas, owned by a man in Missouri who had come west, tried homesteading, and given up. The land was good grass, a reliable creek running through the northeast corner, gentle topography that would work for cattle. He had been saving toward it with careful intention, and in March of 1876, with a loan from the Caldwell Bank that he had negotiated over the previous autumn, he purchased it. He told Ellen about it at dinner after the papers were signed, and she looked at him across the table with little Thomas in his high chair between them. "How much?" she said, meaning the loan. He told her. She turned the number over in her mind the way she turned numbers over, with the financial instinct she had developed from keeping his books. "We can manage it," she said. "If the herd performs this year the way I expect, and if we hold the feed costs where they have been." "That is my assessment also," he said. "Then it is a good decision," she said. "Well done," he looked at her. She was already calculating something in her head, he could tell by the slight focus in her eyes. He loved her unreasonably, he thought, and without shame. "Ellen," he said. She came back from the calculation. "I am glad," he said. "Every day, in case I have not said that recently." She looked at him for a moment. Thomas banged his cup on the tray of the high chair. She reached over without looking and steadied it, her eyes still on her husband. "I know you are," she said. "I am also, every day." She paused. "In case you needed to hear it." "I always need to hear it," he said. "Good," she said, and smiled. Clara, during this time, was attempting to navigate the social landscape of Caldwell with a combination of enthusiasm and strong opinions that was producing interesting results. She had made several friends among the women of the town and was broadly liked, but she had also developed a particular combative relationship with a man named Robert Hale who ran the feed store, a relationship that Charles and Ellen observed with increasing certainty was not what either of them claimed it was. The argument about the price of feed in September of 1876 was, as far as Charles could tell, an argument about the price of feed in the same way that the argument about the stacking of the wood in November was an argument about wood. Clara and Robert Hale were each entirely convinced of their own positions on all matters and entirely incapable of discussing any subject without it becoming animated. And the animation had a quality to it that was only visible from outside, where you could see what they were not saying. "She is not going to admit it," Ellen said, sitting with Charles on the porch in the October evening while Clara and Robert Hale conducted another vigorous discussion about something in the kitchen that Charles could hear through the window. "He will not either," Charles said. "How long do you think?" Ellen asked. 6 months, Charles said. "I say 4, Ellen said. "I will not wager against you," Charles said. "You are better at predicting people than I am." Ellen leaned against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat on the porch in the autumn evening with the prairie spread out before them and the sound of Clara and Robert Hale's vigorous discussion inside the house. And in the bassinet in the parlor, little Thomas slept with the absolute confidence of someone who had never had cause to doubt the world. Ellen was right. It was 4 months. By February of 1877, Clara and Robert Hale were keeping company officially, with all the slightly bewildered quality of two people who had been the last to understand what everyone else had seen clearly. Clara came to Ellen first with the news, sitting in the kitchen with her coffee and something that was trying very hard not to be a smile. "He asked if he could call properly," Clara said. "Imagine that," Ellen said with great composure. "Ellen, you have argued with that man approximately 140 times in the past 6 months. They were legitimate arguments," Clara said. "He was wrong about the feed prices." "He was right about the wood," Ellen said. "He was partially right about the wood," Clara said. "There is a difference." Ellen looked at her with a warmth that had nothing to do with disagreement. "Are you happy?" she said, directly and simply, the way she asked things. Clara looked at her coffee. "Yes," she said quietly. "I think I am going to be very happy." Ellen put her hand over Clara's on the table. "Good," she said. "That is all that matters." The following spring, 1877, brought with it both a new season and a second pregnancy. Ellen told Charles in April, when the spring grass was coming up and the new calves were out in the expanded pasture, standing on uncertain legs in the new sunshine. He was better prepared this time, and his hands were steady, but the feeling in his chest was the same, large and full and impossible to adequately express. This birth was in December. Another boy, William James, who arrived in a snowstorm with considerably more ceremony than Thomas had managed, requiring Charles to ride to town in the dark for Mrs. Holloway while Clara stayed with Ellen. And the whole operation reduced Charles Ramsey to a state of anxiety that was remarkable in a man of his general composure. William was different from Thomas from the first, quieter, more observant, with Ellen's coloring, and what Charles already suspected was going to be Ellen's way of watching the world carefully before deciding what to make of it. Thomas was 3 by the time William arrived, and he regarded his brother with the benevolent condescension of a child who has had the floor to himself, and is generous enough not to make an issue of sharing it. Clara married Robert Hale in the spring of 1878, in the same church where Charles and Ellen had married, with what the town of Caldwell considered quite a celebration. She moved into the house above the feed store, which Robert had expanded and renovated, and the dynamic of the Ramsey homestead shifted slightly quieter without Clara's particular brand of presence. But she was in town and came out regularly, and the relationship between her and Ellen had become the kind of friendship that sits between family and choice, and is more durable than either. By 1879, the Ramsey homestead was one of the more established operations in the area around Caldwell. The 400 acres Charles had purchased had been fully incorporated into the cattle operation, which now ran 130 head, and the combination of Ellen's careful accounting and Charles's skill with the land and livestock had produced a stability that felt earned in the specific way that things feel earned when you have done the work yourself. They were not wealthy, but they were secure, and there was a meaningful difference between those two things that both of them had experienced the absence of. On an evening in October of that year, October, which was the month that had started all of it, Charles came in from the cattle to find Ellen sitting at the kitchen table with a piece of paper in her hand and an expression on her face that he could not immediately read. "What is it?" he said. She looked up. "A letter from Wichita," she said. She paused. "From a woman I used to know there. She writes to tell me that Gerald Crane lost his business last year. Substantial debts. The building I worked in is now under different ownership." She paused again. She thought I would want to know. Charles hung his coat on the hook by the door and came to the table and sat down. He looked at his wife. "How does that sit with you?" he asked. Ellen looked at the letter for a moment. "I would be lying if I said there was no satisfaction in it," she said. "He was not a good man, and the world is not worse for him having less power in it." She put the letter down. "But I also find that I care about it much less than I expected to. I thought I would, that it would feel like more, but it just feels distant, like something that happened to someone else." "Because it did, in a way," Charles said. "The woman he drove out of Wichita is not the woman sitting here." She looked at him. "No," she said, "she is not." A pause. "She is considerably better off, I think." "I am somewhat biased on that point," he said, "but I agree completely." She smiled at him, that open, real smile, and reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "Charles," she said, "yes, I have been thinking." She was watching his face with the careful attention she always paid him. "Thomas will be old enough for a proper school in 2 years, and there is still no school in this district worth calling one." He knew that look. "What are you thinking?" he said. "I have been corresponding with Alice Brennan," she said. Alice Brennan was the woman she had been helping toward the school the year after their marriage. "She has found 2 other women who want to push for a proper schoolhouse. We need a building and we need a teacher." She paused. "I want to be more directly involved. I know we are busy here." "Ellen," he said, "when have I ever told you no?" She considered. "Never," she said. "Then why are you asking?" "Because it will take time I currently spend on the books," she said. "Then we will manage the books differently," he said. "Get Clara's help if you need it. She is better at figures than people know." He squeezed her hand. "If you want to help build a school, build a school. This territory needs one, and you are the best person I know to help make it happen." She looked at him for a moment with an expression that combined affection and exasperation in the particular proportion that he had come to understand as her deepest form of endearment. "You are entirely impossible to argue with," she said. "I know," he said. "You have tried." "I have never tried," she said, "because you are always right, which is extremely irritating." "I am not always right," he said. "I was wrong about the south fence in '76 and wrong about the spring calving date in '78. "You are right about the things that matter," she said quietly. He looked at her. The lamp was low and the kitchen was warm and the boys were asleep in the back room, and the sound of the prairie wind moved around the house, and he thought about a night 6 years ago when he had walked across a cold, dark yard with a lantern and found a woman sleeping in the hay. "Ellen," he said. "Yes." She was still watching him. "Do you remember the night in the barn?" he said. "What do you remember about it?" She looked at him for a moment. She had never asked him about that night directly, and he had never described it to her, and what she knew she had pieced together from small things he had said over the years. "I woke up cold," she said. "And then I was warm and I did not know why, and I was afraid to open my eyes in case the warmth was gone if I looked at it. And then I felt the weight of the blanket and it was so," she shook her head. "It was so careful, the way it was laid over me. It was not careless. Someone had thought about it." "I thought about it," he said. "I know," she said. "I did not know it then, but I know it now. And in the morning when I looked at you in the doorway I thought this man could have asked me to leave or demanded to know what I was doing there, and instead he brought blankets." She looked at his face. "I thought I do not know what kind of man brings blankets instead of questions. I want to know." A pause. "I still want to know. I am still finding out." "Good," he said. "I hope it takes a very long time." "I intend for it to," she said. They sat together at the kitchen table in the lamplight. This man who had built something real from honest work, and this woman who had walked 50 miles alone on worn-out boots and had been changed by both the walking and the arriving. And outside the prairie moved under the October stars just as it had moved on every night before this one and would move on every night after, indifferent and enormous and beautiful. The school opened in Caldwell in the autumn of 1880, a proper one-room schoolhouse with a wood stove, and a good teacher hired from Missouri and 23 students on the first day of class, Thomas Ramsey among them. He went that morning with his hair combed flat by his mother and his slate under his arm, and the expression of a boy who was not sure whether to be excited or suspicious. And Charles and Ellen stood in the schoolhouse yard and watched him go in, and Charles put his arm around his wife, and she leaned against him, and they were both quiet for a moment. "You helped build that," Charles said. "We helped build it," she said. "The whole community did." "You organized the whole community," he said. "That is rather more than helping." "I had a very good teacher in persistence," she said. "Your father," he said. "Yes," she said. "And also a man who once brought me blankets instead of demanding explanations, and who made me understand that decency is a practice, not a trait." She paused. "He influences me considerably." He looked at her. She was looking at the schoolhouse door where Thomas had disappeared, and she was smiling. "I love you," he said. He did not say it casually, he never said it casually, but he said it directly and simply, the way he did everything. She looked up at him. "I know you do," she said. "I have known it since that first morning when you put coffee in front of me and did not ask a single thing I was not ready to answer." She took his hand. "I love you too, Charles, in case that also needs saying." "It always needs saying," he said. She laughed, and he laughed with her, there in the schoolhouse yard in the October morning. And William toddled between them and reached up for both of their hands, and they each gave him one. The three of them standing together in the particular bright cold of a Kansas autumn, surrounded by the open land and the enormous sky, and the whole long, ordinary, extraordinary life spreading out before them. The years afterward did not unfold without difficulty, because no life does. There was a hard winter in 1882 that took 3 cattle and cost them significantly, and required 2 months of very careful management to keep the finances from unraveling. There was a dry summer in 1883 that burned the kitchen garden and reduced the feed supply, and made the cattle operation tense through the fall. There were illnesses, a week when both boys were down with fever at the same time, and Ellen and Charles did not sleep properly for 6 days, taking turns through the night with wet cloths and broth. And on the 4th night, Charles sat beside Thomas's bed in the small hours and made the kind of quiet private deals with Providence that people make when they are afraid. And Thomas recovered, and so did William, and they were both fine. And Charles did not speak about those deals he had made, but he kept them, in his way. In 1884, Ellen told him about the 3rd child at breakfast in October. She had a particular relationship with October announcements. They both noted, and this time he kept his hands perfectly steady, and he got up from his chair and came around the table and took her face in his hands and kissed her forehead, and she held his wrists and laughed softly. "You are steady this time," she said. "I am not steady," he said into her hair. "I am just better at hiding it." "You have never been good at hiding anything," she said. "I know," he said. "It is one of my consistent failures." The 3rd child was a girl, born in June of 1885, and they named her Margaret after Ellen's aunt, who had written every month since the marriage and who was part of their lives in the durable way of good correspondence and annual visits. Margaret Ramsey arrived in the summer, an entirely different season from her brothers, and with a disposition that her father described as sunny, which Ellen privately thought was one of the most accurate things Charles had ever said. On the evening after Margaret was born and the house had settled into the particular quiet of a newborn sleeping, Charles sat on the edge of the bed beside Ellen, who was exhausted and luminous in the lamplight, and he held the baby while Ellen rested, and he looked at this daughter of his with the same gravity he had brought to everything. "She has your coloring," Ellen said, watching him hold the baby. "She has your mouth," he said. "She has her own mouth," Ellen said. "She is herself." "Yes," he said. He looked up from the baby to his wife. "Ellen, Charles, I want to tell you something," he said. His voice was quiet and serious in the way it got when he was saying something he had been holding for a long time. "I want to tell you that," He stopped. He tried again. There is not a version of my life I can imagine that is better than this one. Not a version where things went differently, not a version where I made different choices. This is, he shook his head. This is all of it, everything I did not know I was building toward. Ellen looked at him for a long moment. The lamp was soft and the baby was small and warm in his arms, and the Kansas summer moved gently outside the window. I remember that night, she said quietly. Every detail of it. The cold before the blankets came. The weight of them. The particular warmth which was different from being accidentally warm. It was intentional warmth, do you understand? Someone meant for me to be warm. And in the morning you were in that doorway and I knew, I did not have the word for it yet, but I knew. She looked at his face. I have known since that first morning exactly what kind of man you are, Charles Ramsey. It has never once surprised me. Everything since then has only been the confirmation of what I saw in a barn door in October. He held her eyes. He had nothing to add to that. He did not try to add to it. He leaned forward and kissed her, gently, with the baby asleep between them, and she put her hand against his cheek and kept him there for a moment. Clara and Robert Hale had their first child that same year, a boy they named after Robert's father, and the two families grew alongside each other through the latter half of the decade in the way of families who have chosen each other as well as finding themselves related. The Ramsey homestead and the Hale feed store became fixed points of Caldwell life, and the schoolhouse that Ellen had helped build continued to operate, passing through 3 teachers in 10 years, and eventually landing on a young woman from Ohio named Miss Pierce, who was exactly the right person for it and who stayed for 12 years. Thomas grew up practical and hard-working, and with his father's steadiness and his mother's precision, and by the time he was 16, he was doing full work on the ranch and planning with Charles for the eventual operation of it. He had his grandfather's name, and as it turned out, something of his grandfather's love of learning, and he read everything Ellen put in front of him with the same appetite she had once had and still had. William was the one who surprised them. By 12, he had shown a talent for drawing and a fascination with machinery that did not entirely fit the ranch, and by 15, he was apprenticed to a man in Caldwell who repaired wagons and farm equipment, and showed a mechanical aptitude that his parents watched with more curiosity than disappointment. The world was changing. It was the late 1880s now, and the railroads were reaching everywhere and the frontier was closing, and the kind of skills that machines required were going to be as valuable as the skills that land required. Let him go where his talents take him, Ellen said to Charles one evening, in the quiet of the kitchen after the children were in bed. It was one of those fundamental discussions they had about once a year, the ones that shape decisions. He is not a rancher. He never has been, and that is all right. I know, Charles said. He had known it for years. I just want him to have what he needs. He has what he needs, Ellen said. He has a father who will support him in whatever direction he goes. That is the thing he needs. Charles nodded slowly. You are right. I know I am, she said, without any particular self-congratulation. He looked at her across the table. She was 42 now, and the years had not diminished her, had, if anything, deepened her. There were lines at the corners of her eyes that were the product of working in the sun and of laughing, and her hair had a few threads of gray that she did not apologize for, and she carried herself with the particular composure of a person who knows exactly who they are. What? She said, seeing him look. Nothing, he said. I am just looking at you. You do that sometimes, she said. Yes, he said. I expect I always will. She gave him a look that was compounded of love and exasperation and warmth and the specific intimacy of 20 years of morning coffee and late-night conversations and children born and winters endured and springs come again. It was the look that had no adequate translation into words but which said, simply and completely, I am here. I have always been here. I will always be here. In the spring of 1893, Charles purchased the last piece of land that completed what he had been building toward for 20 years. a 60-acre parcel at the western edge of his holding that gave him a continuous line of property from the original homestead to the creek that ran through the eastern pasture. He had the deed in his hand, and he drove home and walked into the kitchen and set it on the table in front of Ellen, who looked at it and then at him. She picked it up and read it carefully, the way she read everything, and when she was done she set it down and she looked at him for a long moment. "Done," she said. "Done," he said. She stood up and came to him and put her arms around him there in the kitchen in the afternoon light, and he held her and they stood like that for a while, this man and this woman who had built something real and lasting out of a barn door left unlatched and a decision to bring blankets instead of asking questions. "Do you know what I was thinking?" Ellen said, still in his arms, "when I was walking to Caldwell from Wichita, those 2 weeks?" "Tell me," he said. "I was thinking that I had nothing," she said, "that I was starting with nothing and I did not know where I would end." She paused. "I kept walking because stopping felt worse. But I did not have a picture of anything good at the end of it. I was just walking toward a direction." He was quiet, listening. "And then I woke up warm," she said, "after being cold for a long time, and that was the beginning of the picture." She lifted her head and looked at him. "You were the beginning of the picture, Charles. Everything since then has been the filling in of it." He looked at her face, this woman who had walked 50 miles alone in October and had arrived in his barn like something the prairie had sent him specifically, and he thought that he could talk about gratitude for the rest of his life and not use up what he felt. "I brought blankets," he said. "That is all I did." "No," she said firmly. "You brought blankets instead of questions. That is not the same thing." She held his gaze. "Any number of men might have brought the blankets. You brought them instead of demanding what you had every right to demand, an explanation, an account, a reason. You gave comfort first and asked nothing second." She shook her head. "I have thought about that every day since, what it means about a person, what it means about what love ought to look like." He took her face in his hands. The way he had 25 years ago, he had taken the face of the woman who had walked into his life through an unlatched door, and he looked at her steadily. "I love you, Ellen," he said. "All the years, all of it." She covered his hands with hers. "I know you do," she said, "and I love you, all of it." A pause. "Every blanket." He laughed, and she laughed with him. And through the window the Kansas afternoon light was doing what it always did, filling the sky and the grass with the particular gold that they had both loved since before they knew each other. The light that had made them both choose to stay in a country that was difficult and beautiful and demanded everything you had. Margaret came through the door from the schoolyard with mud on her boots and a drawing of a horse clutched in one hand, and she stopped and looked at her parents standing in the middle of the kitchen holding each other and laughing, and she regarded this with the assessment of a child who has grown up in a house full of that kind of warmth and considers it the natural state of things. "What are you laughing at?" she said. "Nothing specific," Charles said. "Come and let your mother see that horse." Margaret came over and held up the drawing with the pride of an 8-year-old who has executed something correctly, and Ellen took it and praised it properly. And the afternoon went on around them in the warm kitchen of the Ramsey homestead on the Kansas plains, where the grass moved in the wind outside and the smoke rose from the chimney, and inside there was the sound of a family not perfect, not easy, not without all the ordinary difficulty of living, but full, complete. Exactly what it was supposed to be. That evening, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Charles and Ellen sat on the porch in the warm May dark and listened to the night sounds of the prairie, the insects and the distant cattle and the far-off call of something in the grass. And Ellen had her head on Charles's shoulder and his arm was around her, and the stars were out in the enormous Kansas sky and nothing needed to be said. But after a while Ellen said, quietly, "Charles." "Yes," he said. "I am glad you did not latch the barn door." He smiled into the dark. "I am glad every single day," he said. She took his hand in both of hers and held it, and they sat there together on the porch of their home on the prairie that was theirs and had been built by their work and their love and their particular quality of attention to each other. And the night moved around them gentle and vast, and full of the kind of peace that can only be found by people who have worked for it and chosen it, deliberately and every day. The way you choose to bring blankets to someone who is cold without asking anything in return. The way you choose to sit beside someone in the lamplight and say, "I love you," and mean it without reservation or condition. The way you choose, morning after morning after morning, the specific person sleeping beside you, the specific life you have made together, and call it everything. It was everything. It had been everything from the beginning, from the first moment of warmth in the cold dark of a Kansas barn in October of 1873, and it would be everything for all the mornings and all the years that came after, for as long as the light lasted on the prairie and the grass moved, and the sky kept its particular and unrepeatable gold. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was the whole and sufficient world.